Happy Halloween. Yes, I know it's not Halloween yet, but the next time we meet, it will be November. So, this is the Halloween episode. Welcome to Crime Dive, the Halloween episode. My name is Crystal Sky, and if you're anything like me, you find yourself drawn to true crime cases. So, that's what I talk about. If you like true crime, and you also want to feel better about your makeup skills, because, I can't even, put barrettes in my hair, you should totally subscribe, and let's hang out together every Tuesday where I will take a deep dive look into a true crime case while slapping on the old clown paint. So yes, happy Halloween. It's here. My favorite holiday. Please let me know down below. Do you have kids? Do you take them trick-or-treating? Are you doing anything fun? Are you dressing up? Let me know. I love Halloween so much. I love this time of year. And when I came across this case, I just thought it was sort of a good case to do for Halloween because, oh my god, when I was researching it, oh my god, it freaked me out. And I think it speaks to a lot of people's fears, which is a fear of the doctor, right? Of the medical world. Today, we will be covering the case of Christopher Duntsch, aka Dr. Death. And this case was a recommended case, and oh my god, I was totally floored when I came across this case. So thank you so much to Burgundy Baby. Thank you so much for recommending this case to me. And yes, I am looking into the other case you suggested because, wow, that one is just really heart-wrenching. But for today's case, we're talking about Christopher Duntsch here, guys. Have you heard of this case? It's, recent. And if you haven't heard of him, he was a neurosurgeon, all right? And it's a neurosurgeon who maimed and or killed his patients. 33 of them. Yeah. Isn't that frightening? The doctor is already stressful enough, without worrying about your surgeon potentially being a serial killer. Yeah, we'll get all into it. Some people wonder if he was a serial killer. It's bizarre. It's bizarre, all right? And, there's really no clear-cut answer as to why Chris did these things. It's pretty wild. It's pretty wild. So, yeah, buckle up because we are gonna get into the case of Dr. Death. And thank you once again, Burgundy Baby, for recommending this case. Now, disclaimer-wise, we are going to get into, Chris was a neurosurgeon, all right? So he did a lot of spinal surgeries and stuff. So, we will be talking about that. Nothing, too gruesome or detailed, but with medical stuff, some people really can't, handle, anything regarding that. So, yeah, just a forewarning. And, oh boy, let's go ahead and get started on this case. So, Christopher Daniel Duntsch was born on April 3rd, 1971 in Montana. His father, Donald Duntsch, was a physical therapist and a Christian missionary, while Chris's mother, Susan Duntsch, was a school teacher. Now, Chris was the oldest of 4 siblings. He had 2 younger brothers named Nathan and Matt, and a younger sister named Liz. Now, though Chris was born in Montana, he spent most of his youth and was primarily raised in Memphis, Tennessee. Now, Chris had a very privileged upper middle class upbringing, attending private schools. He ended up attending and graduating a private high school, evangelical Christian school, which was located in the suburb of Cordova in Memphis. And at evangelical Christian school, Chris played on the football team. He was specifically a linebacker. Now, Chris's father, Donald, was a gridiron standout over in Montana, and Chris was determined to follow in his father's footsteps. After high school, Chris then attended Millsaps College over in Mississippi, and here he played Division III college football. But Chris had his sights set on playing Division I football, and he had his sights set on Colorado State University. And in his sophomore year, Chris went to CSU and was one of the few walk-on players of the team. Now, Chris's teammates say that though he practiced hard and was clearly dedicated and wanted to do well, when it came to raw talent, Chris just didn't have it, he just didn't have the raw talent. His fellow linebacker, another boy named Chris, And it's either Chris Dezois or Chris Dezois. I found two pronunciations for that last name. It was Dozois. But yeah, he was a fellow linebacker, so we'll call him Christopher. And he said that Chris couldn't even get like the basic drills down, like couldn't even get those right. Quote, he'd be, "Coach, I promise I can get this. Let me do it again." He'd go through, he'd screw it up again. I gathered very quickly that everything he had accomplished in sports had come with sweat equity. When people said you weren't going to be good enough, he outworked that and made it happen. This was according to, Chris's fellow linebacker. Now, Chris would not graduate from Colorado State University. He would return home to Memphis and attend Memphis State University. It is now known as the University of Memphis. And this was in Chris's junior year, so apparently he was only at Colorado State for 1 year because he went to Colorado State in his sophomore year, and in his junior year, he's now back home in Memphis. Now, Chris claimed that he went home to Memphis because he was homesick. And I guess he was talking to his fellow linebacker, Christopher, who we just talked about. And I guess he was telling him, all tearfully and he's totally bummed out that he couldn't play football at the University of Memphis. And this was because he had I guess, too many transfers. Like something about his transfer made him ineligible to play football. So not quite sure what that was about, but yeah, he was super bummed because, he wanted to make football his career and this was the end of that. So when Chris realized that his dreams of playing football were just not going to happen, he then set his sights on medicine. Yeah, he then went for a medical degree. He completed his undergraduate degree in 1995. Other sources said 1994, so 94-95, and he continued on to what was described as a very ambitious MD-PhD program. He earned his MD, doing so well that he was actually among the 12% of medical school graduates who were named to the elite Alpha Omega Medical Honor Society. Again, only 12% of the graduates in his class earned their way into this honor society, and Chris was one of them. Now, Chris stayed at University of Memphis for his surgical residency, and as said, spent the standard 5 years in neurosurgery and 1 in general surgery. In 2005, when he was about a third of the way through his program, the department chairman, Dr. John Robertson, appointed Chris program director of the school's tissue bank. And here, Chris would supply samples to other scientists and oversee 2 labs. And it is here where Chris earned a lot of experience in writing grants. And during his time there, actually earned over $3 million in federal, state, and local funding for research projects. And on these research projects, Chris served as the principal or co-principal investigator. At one point, Chris had even given the then governor of Tennessee a tour of the campus and explained to the governor what they were doing at their program, explaining the stem cell research they were conducting. And it said Chris was constantly immersed in research and writing grants. That's really where he got his main experience. And in 2006, Chris found a way to commercialize the discoveries by 2 Russian scientists. They were renowned Russian stem cell scientists. They were a husband and wife team, and we're gonna try with the names here, so bear with me. Their names were Valery Kukakov and Tatiana Ignatova. And yeah, in 2006, Chris found a way to commercialize some groundbreaking research that this husband-wife team had discovered. Now, it is said during this time period, the first little cracky cracks showed in Chris's facade that he had. This was the first time there are some noticeable stumbles. So Kukakov, Valery Kukakov, the husband of the scientist team, had discovered stem cells in brain tumors, and this presented a huge potential for the development of new cancer-fighting drugs. He had also discovered a way to produce stem cells from intervertebral? Oh my gosh, this is going to be a long one. He had also discovered a way to produce stem cells from intervertebral discs in cultures outside the body. And creating cells like this permaculture would eliminate the need for human extraction of stem cells. So yeah, I would say pretty big deal, right? Now, Chris filed patents for the discoveries of Kukikoff and Ignatova, and 2 companies were soon created. Novastem Therapeutics was one, and this company attempted to monetize the cancer stem cell discovery, but it failed after taking a huge funding hit in 2008. The other company, Disc Genius, was more successful and still owns the patent for the technology and is still in operation today. And Chris, Kukikoff, and Ignatova are all listed as inventors, although both Kukikoff and Ignatova's names are misspelled, and Ignatova said, quote, "Nobody can recognize whether it was ours or not." Yeah, I guess the name misspelling is like a pretty big deal. And while Kukikoff and Ignatova had been in like the research labs doing like the grunt work and doing like the actual work, Chris was more, he kind of acted more like a financier, you know, like he was the one getting like funding and like investors and stuff like that. One of these investors was Dr. Robertson. He had talked Dr. Robertson into investing. Now, both Russian scientists, all right, both of Kukikoff and Ignatova, they claim that Chris took way more credit than he should have. Kukikoff said, quote, "It wasn't his invention. It was the invention of me and my wife, because we made all the primary experiments. We discovered it." In 2010, Chris completed the MD, PhD, and neurosurgery residency programs at the University of Tennessee Health Science Center. And he subsequently spent a 1-year spine fellowship at the Semmes Murphy Clinic located in Memphis. This is one of the largest neurosurgery practices in the US. It is said here Chris studied under a prominent neurosurgeon named Dr. Kevin Foley. So yeah, sounds like he, you know, is pretty impressive, right? However, when Chris completed his program in 2010, he completed his residency having completed less than 100 surgeries. Now, normally, neurosurgery residents participate in no fewer than 1,000 surgeries before completing their program in residency. So there's some questions about that, and questions that, you know, I couldn't really find answers to. I'm not sure how he was able to complete his residency with participating in fewer than 100. It is also rumored and suspected that Chris operated while under the influence of cocaine in his 4th year of residency. Yeah. Now, Chris was sent to a program for impaired physicians, and he would remain here for several months. And then when he was done, he was allowed to return to his residency and pick up where he left off. Now, several of Chris's friends at this time recall that, yeah, around this time, Chris was a pretty heavy partier. They said Chris would go to work after a heavy night of partying, and this included, you know, drinking and doing drugs. A female friend that was around Chris during this time, named Megan Kane, said that one time she was partying with Chris, all right? It was like around 2006, 2007, it was around Chris's birthday. And it is at this party when they're, you know, hanging out and partying that she said she saw Chris eat a paper blotter of LSD and mix it with some painkillers. She also said that they all had consumed some cocaine from a small pile that Chris kept on the dresser of his home office. Now, also present during these times, according to Megan, was one of Chris's friends that he had had since childhood. This friend's name was Jerry Summers. And yeah, Megan said it was often, you know, her, Chris, and Jerry and some other friends that would, you know, hang out and party. Megan actually dated Jerry for a little bit. She dated for a year, and during that time, Megan said that when they were, you know, when they had all partied on LSD and cocaine and had, you know, been up through the night, she would see Chris put on his lab coat, go into work, and make his rounds. She said, quote, "I thought it was pretty amazing that he was even able to go to work the next day. Like, he wasn't scared. He didn't not want to. He wasn't paranoid. After you've spent a night using cocaine, most people become paranoid and want to stay in their house. They don't want to go participate in any extraneous activities." And he was totally fine going to work. This is what Megan witnessed. There was another one of Chris's friends who knew him during this time period, and they said they themselves would have never allowed Chris to operate on them. So yeah, it seems that Chris definitely partied his way through residency and through school. So around this time, 2010, 2011, when he's completed his residency program, Chris definitely goes through some ups and downs, all right? So in 2011, Chris was actually sued by Disc Genius, specifically by their former chief operating officer, their COO. It was a high school friend of Chris's, and they had joined the company when it was founded. This friend said that when he joined on, Chris promised to pay him in stocks and out of his own salary. But apparently Chris had failed to follow through. And that July in 2011, I guess Chris was, writing panicked emails to business partners at 4 a.m., writing, quote, "My reputation has been ruined. I have lost both companies." And it is around this time period when he's being pushed out of Disc Genius that Chris realizes that the research that he's been doing all this time, it's not as lucrative, it's drying up. And that's when he decided to focus on clinical work. And it was purely because of the money. And in that same year, 2011, he would be removed from Disc Genius's board of directors and removed as their chief science officer. So yeah, things aren't going too well, but it was around this 2010, 2011 time period that Chris would actually meet someone in Memphis. He met his future girlfriend and partner, Wendy Renee Young. Wendy, who was 27, and Chris, who was 44, actually met at a restaurant/bar called The Beauty Shop located in Memphis. Wendy was a dancer at a strip club at this time, and they met when, Chris offered to buy her an appletini, and she allowed him, and the two struck up a conversation. The two actually, hit it off, and so they went back to Chris's home, and here they danced under a disco ball that he had in his home office. And yeah, they just danced and talked. Wendy said, quote, "He was friendly, and we had good conversation. It's hard to find good conversation with a random person." And from this moment on, yeah, they would kind of become a thing, and the relationship moved really, really fast. Really fast. Within 3 months, Wendy moved in with Chris. And then not too long after moving in, I think mere months, Wendy became pregnant with the first of their 2 sons, whom they would name Aiden and Preston. Now, unbeknownst to Wendy, when Chris met her, he was in debt by about $500,000, and I do not think she was aware of this fact. And I'm not sure if it was because of all the legal trouble with Disc Genius or what, but he was in debt by quite a lot. In the spring of 2011, so right as he's, getting pushed out of Disc Genius, Chris ended up moving to Dallas, Texas. Another source said that he went to Dallas in late 2010. So yeah, 2010, 2011, around there. And Wendy went with him. Wendy said that Chris actually had offers from all over. San Diego, New York, and Dallas. And she had told Chris, hey, if you go to Dallas, I will totally go with you. I have family there. And yeah, I would love to move there with you. So Chris took the offer in Dallas, Texas. Now, when he moves to Dallas at this time, Chris appears very, very qualified on paper, all right? He, had spent a total of 15 years in training, medical school, residency, and fellowships. And his curriculum vitae, or resume, was 12 single-spaced pages, and it listed all of his research and all of his work and qualifications. Chris also claimed to have graduated magna cum laude from St. Jude Children's Research Hospital, specifically with a doctorate in microbiology, a program that this hospital did not even offer at the time Chris says that he attended and graduated. In fact, Chris also has 0 pictures and 0 presents in yearbooks from the University of Tennessee Health Services Center. And of course, the school has, declined to ever, verify or deny any of Chris's claims, citing, privacy laws. So I'm not sure what we're supposed to do with that information. Obviously the St. Jude's thing is BS, but I thought that was weird when it said he had no yearbook presence in the University of Tennessee's, yearbooks and stuff. So yeah, I'm not sure what is going on there, but yeah, it's definitely weird. So moved to Dallas, right? He took an offer that he had in Dallas. This offer was from the Minimally Invasive Spine Institute located in North Dallas. And yeah, Chris had accepted their position and was hired on May 24th, 2011. This clinic was run by doctors Michael Rimlai and Douglas Wan. And like I said, they recruited Chris right out of Memphis. because remember, like I said, he looked qualified on paper, right? Now, the physician services agreement that Chris signed with the Spine Institute required Chris to get privileges at Baylor Regional Medical Center for Plano. It is now referred to as Baylor, Scott, and White Medical Center, Plano. So yeah, Chris had to get surgical privileges from here, and he ended up receiving these privileges on July 1st. But I don't think they were like full surgical privileges yet. Like researching this case, there, like I found it very interesting that, yeah, that's how it works with surgeons. Like they got to get like surgical privileges at like hospitals and medical centers or wherever, which, yeah, I thought that was super interesting. So if you know like any information about that, please let me know. Like I have learned so much through the comments because there's just so many like different experts and people with just different knowledge and experiences and stuff. And yeah, I'm so curious to know, like, yeah, so like there's like limited privileges and like full surgical privileges or something. And yeah, I just thought the whole thing was like super interesting. But yeah, by July 2011, Chris has gotten at least some sort of limited surgical privileges at Baylor, and Chris's base compensation with the Spine Institute was $600,000 a year. And this would be for 2 years, beginning in June of 2011. He would also receive 40% of all revenue he generated that was beyond $800,000 each year. So if he generated that much for the Spine Institute, anything over that, he would receive 40% of it. Like, what a sweet deal. In August of the same year, Chris hired an assistant. Her name was Kimberly Morgan, and she had clinical experience and often spent a lot of time with Chris while he was conducting his research. But it didn't take long for Dr. Rimlai to start raising an eyebrow at Chris and start getting really suspicious of him. He said, quote, "Something was wrong, whether it be impairment from drugs, alcohol, mental illness, or a combination of all three." Yeah, so what happened? What happened to Chris at the Spine Institute? Well, let me tell ya. So on Chris's first and only surgery with the Spine Institute, he seemingly took off on a patient. So the surgery was scheduled for Thursday, and it was going to be performed at Baylor. Is that why, like, surgeons need surgical privileges at different places? Because, like, the surgeries can take place at, like, a clinic or a hospital or something? Anyway, so, yeah, there's surgery. It's scheduled for Thursday, and it's supposed to be performed at Baylor, right? So it is said that Chris performed the surgery, right? It's fine. But the problem is, it is said that Chris allegedly flew out of town, like, right after the operation. He went for, like, a huge weekend trip to Las Vegas. And the problem with this was that he had taken off without securing a call physician for his patient. And apparently this is, like, a really big deal and a really big no-no. Chris was gone until Monday. And in between that time, between Thursday and Monday, Baylor had tried to get a hold of Chris to, confer about his patients and stuff. The hospital had tried to get a hold of him, and they couldn't. And when they couldn't, they called the Spine Institute and got a hold of Dr. Rimlai. And days after Chris had returned to Dallas, he was promptly fired from the Spine Institute. Now, Chris claims that the Institute did not meet up to the terms they had negotiated on, and that it actually still owes him money. He claims that the surgery that he performed at Baylor did not happen on Thursday. It happened earlier in the week, and he had secured Dr. Rimlai as the call physician before he left for Vegas, and claims that he contacted Dr. Rimlai about this. That's what Chris claims. But though Chris was fired from the Spine Institute, he was not gone from Baylor Plano. Remember, he'd gotten some partial surgical, privileges there, and he was able to stay on over there. They hired him on. And he was specifically hired on as a minimally invasive spinal surgeon. And when he moved to Baylor Plano, Chris took his assistant Kimberly with him. Chris also planned to open his own practice, and in October of 2011, Kimberly actually filed, or rather registered, articles of incorporation to form Chris's practice that he was going to call the Texas Neurosurgical Institute. And it is also this same month in October that Chris would begin an affair with his assistant Kimberly. They would primarily have sex in Chris's office at Baylor Plano, and later Kimberly would say that it is here where Chris would drink vodka and do research after hours. She said he kept a handle of Stoli under his desk, and he told her it was because he used to work with Russians, and that's why. Okay. Chris ended up taking Kimberly to his 5-bedroom home that he shared with Wendy and his son Aiden. They hadn't had Preston yet. And Wendy said, she wasn't really too concerned when Kimberly first started coming around. She didn't think too much of it. She was like, oh yeah, it's his research assistant. He does a lot of research and yeah, don't think anything of it. Chris told Kimberly that Wendy was just his secretary and good friend. What? So I don't know if Kimberly was even aware that Aiden was Chris's son. Who knows? Jerry Summers, remember Chris's childhood friend? He also lived at the home with the family. He had actually moved with the family from Memphis, and he had moved from there to help Chris set up his practice. And he kind of worked as Chris's personal assistant. He had a credit card that was in his own name, but it was attached to Chris's bank account. And it seems that he did a lot of, like running around for Chris, taking him places, balancing his books, picking up his dry cleaning. And it is said that the two friends would often party and go to clubs. According to Kimberly, quote, if he wasn't doing research, he was out with Jerry Summers partying. Wendy claims that Kimberly was also partying with them, but Kimberly denies this. Meanwhile, Chris and Kimberly continued their affair, thinking that, they were very slick. But of course, right, when people have an affair, it's a little more obvious than they think. According to someone who worked at Baylor Plano and witnessed Chris and Kimberly together, they said, quote, it was clear to anyone who's not a complete idiot that they were a thing. So in November, Chris applied for full surgical privileges at Baylor Plano, and he would ultimately be granted these full privileges. Dr. Robertson, remember he was the director from the school, the program director, and he had, put Chris in charge of that tissue bank, gave Chris a glowing recommendation. Quote, his work ethic, character, and ability to get along with others is beyond reproach. And so, when he is granted full surgical privileges at Baylor Plano, his victims would start to mount, y'all, and it's not good. Not good at all. Now, Chris was described as having lots and lots of charm and charisma, and he had this ability to make his patients really like him. He was described as, fast talking, cocksure, confident, which is what a lot of people want in their doctor, right? Especially when they're going to a surgeon, when they're gonna have to go under the knife. They're looking for reassurance. They're looking for confidence, and Chris was able to put that persona on. He was able to sweet talk and endear himself to patients, and he always proclaimed that he was the best. He always had a plan, and he always seemed to be so sure of himself. And yeah, these abilities just really made patients like Chris and trust him. Now, Chris's colleagues, his fellow co-workers, they had a different impression of Chris. So one fellow surgeon, Dr. Randall Kirby, who was a veteran vascular surgeon, said that Chris would frequently boast about his skills, boast about his abilities, despite being very new to the field, Dr. Kirby thought, this guy is awfully braggy for being so new to the field, And it was very off-putting. He would later recall that Chris's skills in the operating room left much to be desired and, quote, he could not wield a scalpel. And that is what we're gonna get into, guys. And oh my God, just so many people that are maimed or worse, killed. Maybe it's not worse for them. It's probably the same, what Chris does to so many people is just horrific. So we'll start with Chris's first patient at Baylor Plano. All right. So after he gets his full surgical privileges and he's ready to go. It was 68-year-old Kenneth Fennell. And he was the first patient that Chris had when he got his privileges in November of 2011. Now, during his operation, Chris operated on the wrong part of Kenneth's back, and this left Kenneth with chronic and debilitating pain. Kenneth later had a second operation, and this was to relieve the pain, and yes, the second operation was performed by Chris. And after this second operation, Kenneth was left significantly paralyzed in his legs. Kenneth would end up requiring months of rehabilitation and physical therapy just to be able to walk with a cane, and was left unable to walk more than 30 feet or stand for more than a few minutes without having to sit back down again. Yeah, can you imagine? Now, Chris denies that Kenneth's surgery was a failure, and he claims that it actually went so well that Kenneth actually agreed to be in a commercial for Baylor Plano. Yeah, that's what Chris thinks. Okay, Chris's second patient was Lee Passmore, and he was a 36-year-old field agent for the Collin County Medical Examiner's Office. In November of 2011, he was addicted to opioids, and this was because he had chronic debilitating back pain. And oh my god, have you ever had back pain? I can't imagine having chronic pain. This pain radiated from Lee's lower back into his legs. He thought surgery might give him some relief from this pain and make it so that he wouldn't have to rely on opioids anymore. He was sick of popping pills. Now, Lee's pain management specialist advised against such a surgery, but he did give Lee Chris's card, which I don't get. Was that surgeon just not comfortable, performing that operation? So he thought, oh, well, Chris knows how to do that surgery. I'll send him that way? I don't know. So with the recommendation, Lee went to meet with Chris, and of course, Chris spun his usual charm, and Lee's surgery was scheduled. And it was scheduled for December 30th, 2011. So on the day of Lee's surgery, Dr. Mark Hoyle, who is a vascular surgeon and was the general surgeon during Lee's surgery, had only met Chris the day of Lee's surgery. All right, he had never met him before that. And he met him before the surgery in the physician's lounge. He said that Chris was making very bizarre statements, such as, quote, "Everybody's doing it wrong. I'm the only clean, minimally invasive guy in the whole state." Dr. Hoyle said that he thought to himself, quote, "I thought he was either really, really good or he's just really, really arrogant and thought he was good." Yeah, like we said, Chris does not make the best first impressions on fellow surgeons and colleagues. Now, during the operation, it was Dr. Hoyle's job to, open up Lee and then close him back up once Chris had done his thing. Now, when Dr. Hoyle opened Lee up, he made a small incision right above Lee's groin and moved the blood vessels and the organs, out of the way so Chris could go in and do his thing. Specifically, so Chris would be allowed to access the lower spine so that he could remove a herniated disc from Lee. The disc was pressing on a nerve, and this was what was causing Lee's chronic pain. So during the operation, Chris cut a ligament, which is normally not even touched during that particular operation, misplaced hardware in Lee's spine, placed a screw that kept this hardware in place, and kept it in place in an incorrect location on Lee's spine, and stripped the threads so bad it could not be removed. It was stuck. And even if Chris hadn't stripped the threads, apparently he placed the screw in a location that would have caused Lee to bleed out if it was removed. How scary. Oh my god, how scary. Now, Dr. Hoyle said that he was alarmed all throughout Lee's procedure. He said that as he saw Chris work, he was alarmed to see nothing but blood, nothing but blood, and it was pooling, and that was very alarming. It was pouring out of the epidural blood vessels and pooling in the disc space. So it was, obviously not good. He said it looked as if Chris was fishing in a pond at night. And Chris said that he was going by feel rather than sight, so he wasn't too alarmed at the blood. What? Chris then announced that he was going to remove the ligament that separates the disc from the spinal canal. Now, this ligament is one of the spine's two major stabilizers and is located less than 1 millimeter from the spinal canal. And at this point, Dr. Hoyle was very alarmed, and he actually stepped in front of Chris to block him from doing any more damage to Lee, and told him that no, we need to talk about this, telling him, quote, "That's dangerous. Even that attitude is dangerous." He would later say that Chris seemed oblivious to the considerable bleeding, but he did let Dr. Hoyle step in and, stem the bleeding and, clean out the wound. And then the operation continued, all right? And then Chris placed a surgical cage where the disc was, and this was to widen the opening around the nerve roots and relieve the pressure that was causing Lee's pain, all right? And it was only later, when Dr. Hoyle was looking at an x-ray of Lee's surgery, that he realized Chris had placed the surgical cage too far to the left. When Chris went back to reposition the cage, he stripped a screw, and now the cage wasn't going anywhere. Later, Dr. Hoyle told Chris to his face that he was a dangerous person, and Dr. Hoyle thought Lee's surgery was so sloppy, so haphazard, he canceled the upcoming 3 or 4 surgeries that he had scheduled with Chris. He wanted nothing to do with this guy. He couldn't believe that, like, a professional would sit there and, like, be this bumbling and this incompetent. And what was worse for Dr. Hoyle was Chris's seemingly nonchalant attitude. He legitimately wondered about Chris's sanity. Now, Kimberly was also present during Lee's surgery, but she claims that she didn't see or hear any altercation between Dr. Hoyle or Chris. But she said that her view was blocked by a microscope, and the combined hum of the EKG machine and the oxygen cylinder had, really drowned out any sound, so she couldn't really hear anything. When Lee woke up from surgery, his screams could be heard all the way out in the lobby where his friends and 2 young daughters were waiting. Yeah, this of course startled them. They were understandably freaked out, and I guess Chris came dashing in, telling them, oh no, everything was fine, and Lee will be up and about in 2 or 3 days. He told them, quote, don't worry about it. And on January 6th, 2012, a week after his initial surgery, Chris went back in. Lee said that the space above a disc in his lower spine had been blown out in the first surgery, and Chris was supposed to go in and pick out all the pieces. Instead, Chris severed a ligament in Lee's leg, and Lee ended up experiencing chronic nerve pain in his back, which was the result of a screw lodged in a nerve bundle. Not only did Lee experience chronic debilitating pain from this moment onward, he could no longer run, swim, play with his children. He suffers incontinence, and he says that he has lost all feeling on the bottom of his feet, which affects your balance. He said it feels like his feet are asleep. Dr. Louis Magnucci went back in to try and stabilize Lee, try to correct his spine and stabilize it and do, kind of fix Chris's mess up. But even with a proper surgeon, the damage was done. It started to affect Lee at his work. Remember, he was a medical investigator for the medical examiner's office. So, if someone died in an apartment building, 4 or 5, 20 stories up, it was Lee's job to go up there, lugging 20 pounds of equipment, and take photos of the crime scene, which included aerial photos. So he would climb on a ladder and get an aerial shot, wide shot of the crime scene. And Chris's surgeries affected his job, affected his ability to do this. He said he would constantly slip off the ladder. Quote, I will slip and fall off that damn ladder. And yeah, needless to say, Lee's life changed for the worse. Can you imagine guys, having your career and thinking that you've got this great surgeon and everything's fine. This is something super simple and everyday to him, and you're you're maimed. Your life is changed forever and not for the good. I can't imagine. And what's even worse is right before Lee's surgery, so after he had maimed Kenneth, but before he had touched Lee, there were more cracks in Chris's facade. So on December 9th, 2011, other sources said that it was December 11th, but it was before Lee's surgery. Chris had sent a 3-page rambling email to Kimberly at 4 a.m. The subject line read Occam's razor. Now, the message alluded to a week between them where, quote, everything unraveled, so I think they may have had maybe a fight or something. Not too sure about that, but he continued on and suspected this had something to do with his, quote, vodka bottle and neurostimulants. He also said in this email that he was $1 million in debt and rambled on, quote, anyone close to me thinks I likely am something between God, Einstein, and the Antichrist. Because how could I do anything I want and cross every discipline boundary like it's a playground and never ever lose? He continued on, quote, unfortunately, you cannot understand that I am building an empire, and I am so far outside the box that the earth is small and the sun is bright. He continued that he was ready to embrace the darkest parts of himself. Quote, you, my child, are the only one between me and the other side. I am ready to leave the love and kindness and goodness and patience that I mix with everything else that I am and become a cold-blooded killer. Yeah, Yeah, not sure, like, the context of that email. Like, I think Kimberly just, checked her email, and there was just, like, this rambling email that was sent at, like, 3 or 4 in the morning. So bizarre. So yeah, even before Lee's surgery, there was already some cracks happening, alright? So after Lee, Chris had another patient. It was 45-year-old Barry Morgoloff. He was the owner of a pool service company, and also helped his family unload trucks for the family's import business. And he was also a nationally ranked skier. So yeah, he was a pretty active guy. Chris ended up operating on Barry less than a week after Lee's second surgery, and this was January 11th, 2012. Now, Barry's surgery was some sort of fusion operation in his lower spine and has been described as, quote, the easiest operation a spine surgeon can do. And it is said just 4 doctors in North Texas perform it. Now, Barry had actually gotten this procedure done once before in 2006 by Dr. J. Michael Desalams, and that had helped relieve the pain. And so Barry went back to Dr. Desalams when he wanted that procedure again, but Dr. Desalams had declined, saying that, Barry didn't really need it and he should try diet and exercise first. And after that, I don't know if Barry was looking for a second opinion or what, but Barry ended up in Chris's office, and he was more than happy to operate on Barry, telling him, quote, I can fix you. Barry would end up being left with bone fragments in his spinal canal after Chris operated and tried to pull a damaged disc out of Barry's back using a grabbing tool rather than a scalpel, a tool that 99.9% of all surgeons use. And he also began jabbing at the disc without cutting it out. Yeah, pretty brutal. This caused Barry to suffer chronic shooting pain, all in his back and left leg. His toes were numb when he awoke from surgery. He couldn't move his left foot. Now, Dr. Randall Kirby had been the general surgeon at Barry's operation and had assisted by cutting into Barry's abdomen and helped move, the organs and the blood vessels away so, Chris could get in and operate. He later recalled that Chris continued making mistakes even after having the correct anatomy pointed out to him. Dr. Kirby said, quote, he performed worse than any spine surgeon I've seen in the operating room. Now, when he awoke in debilitating pain, Chris initially refused to give Barry any pain medication, claiming that Barry was just a, quote, drug seeker. And later, after everything would come out, Chris would defend his surgery on Barry, claiming that he showed Barry's post-operative images to, quote, 16 radiologists over 6 months. All of whom said Barry was normal, and he said this is why he determined that Barry was just a drug user and a drug seeker. Barry had a follow-up appointment with Chris, and at this follow-up appointment, Chris acted really erratically, absolutely refusing to believe that Barry felt any pain in his leg or back. And he wanted Barry to admit that his back felt better and the pain in his leg was from a separate issue. Now, Barry, who was a past drug user himself, so he knew when someone was, tripping balls. He thought Chris looked inebriated during this appointment and that he looked, quote, high as a kite. When Barry sought a second opinion on his case about 8 or 9 months later, he had gone back to Dr. Desalams, who discovered the cause of his debilitating pain. A piece of bone had been knocked off the spine and was pushing on a nerve root, and this was what was causing Barry's pain. The surgical cage, meant to put a space between the vertebrae, was, quote, malpositioned, and the fusion hadn't taken. Dr. Desalams performed a corrective procedure, but Barry would end up losing most of the function on his left side, and he ended up requiring a wheelchair, along with a surgical boot with a special brace and a cane. Yeah, can you imagine going to a doctor who you think is there to relieve your pain, and they end up leaving you worse than when you went in? Oh my God. That would be the worst. Jerry Summers was Chris's next patient. Yeah, his buddy. He came to Baylor Plano to get 2 neck vertebrae fused, and this was to relieve some chronic neck pain that he had experienced since a car accident. And during his friend's surgery, Chris botched the removal of Jerry's disc, damaging the vertebral artery and rendering his friend a quadriplegic. Chris performed a second surgery on Jerry and packed the space with a large amount of anticoagulant gel foam, constricting the spinal cord, and he removed so much bone that Jerry's head was no longer secure on his body, y'all. The anesthesiologist who was working on the surgery and assisting said Jerry lost almost 1,200 milliliters of blood, more than a fifth of his blood volume in 24 hours. Jerry woke up unable to move any of his extremities. He said, quote, "Feels like a big pile of bricks is on your body and your head is sticking out. I knew something was wrong." Chris did not perform a CAT scan or MRI on his friend, and the nurses and the other staffers who had partaken in the surgery and assisted fully expected Jerry to have a revision surgery after this. But get this, Chris refused to do it. When he awoke, Jerry just said that he wanted to die. He was in so much pain. He went on and on to anyone who would listen to that the night before his surgery, he and Chris had indulged in some cocaine. And this caused Baylor Plano president at the time, Jerry Garrison, to call both Chris and Kimberly into her office. And she said that she was going to need a drug test from both of them. Now, Chris claimed that he passed this drug test, but he told Kimberly that he had actually gotten lost on his way to the lab, and he actually never completed it. So I don't know if he ever did complete the drug test. So, not sure what happened, but Baylor Plano officials were concerned enough to at least put Chris on leave pending a peer review. Now, while Chris was cleared to resume operating while the review was pending and underway, hospital officials did ask Chris to limit himself to just minor surgeries until the whole process was complete. He would have his surgical privileges reinstated in March of 2012. Jerry subsequently admitted that the cocaine claim that he made was just made up. He was just angry that his friend hadn't even bothered to check on him when he woke up from surgery, obviously in pain and with something that was wrong. Jerry ended up a quadriplegic for the rest of his life, and he would actually end up passing away in 2021 from an infection related to complications from Chris's botched surgeries. So as far as I'm concerned, he killed his friend. Jerry's lawyer did say that before he died, Jerry had forgiven his friend for what he had done. Damn. So let's go to the first patient Chris has after getting his privileges back at Baylor Plano. This patient was 54-year-old Kelly Martin, and she was a school teacher. Other sources said that she was a school librarian, but either way, it seems to be that she, worked at a school. And she had been suffering chronic back pain for nearly a year after suffering a fall down a ladder. She was reaching up to take down some Christmas decorations and had, fallen and done damage to her back. And in March of 2012, after he gets his surgical privileges reinstated, Kelly went to Chris to alleviate her pain. Now, the procedure Kelly needed was actually a pretty common one called a laminectomy, which involves removing spongy tissue between the discs in order to relieve the pressure. During Kelly's operation, Chris cut through her spinal cord and severed an artery. He continued operating. Despite clear and obvious signs that Kelly was losing massive amounts of blood, he refused to abort the surgery, and this was even after a trauma surgeon and an anesthesiologist warned him about the excessive blood loss and was like, dude, no, we need to stop this. But Chris didn't care. He refused to acknowledge anything was wrong, and it is said he actually hindered the ICU team's efforts to get in and save Kelly. When Kelly did awake from anesthesia, it is said she was screaming and clawing at her legs, and it was so bad the ICU team actually had to sedate her. Meanwhile, as she's waking up from surgery and freaking out, and they're trying to calm her down, it is said Chris, he just stayed out in the ICU waiting room. He was too busy, writing notes rather than attending to his patient, whom he had butchered. And this was even after he had been informed that Kelly had gone into hemorrhagic cardiac arrest. And unfortunately, Kelly would end up dying from massive blood loss because Chris had murdered her. She left behind a husband and 2 adult daughters. They were allowed to see her body, and I guess her husband, Don, ended up cutting off a lock of her hair for a keepsake. That was just so heartbreaking when I read that. Can you imagine going into a pretty simple procedure and your loved one ends up dying? That's horrific. Once again, after this, Baylor Plano asked Chris for a drug test, but it came back diluted with tap water. He took a second test a few days later, and it was clean. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, some of those drugs, don't they, exit your system rather quickly? So let's go back to Lee Passmore. Remember the investigator with the medical examiner's office? Let's go back to him. So in April of 2012, after Kelly has been, killed by Chris, Lee had returned to work pretty much writing a desk. But when the medical examiner's office unfortunately got busy and required Lee to go out in the field, Lee was forced to resign. He couldn't do his job properly anymore. I guess he was still able to access his long-term disability benefits, his disability insurance. And I guess he had paid into this for like 10 years. So he was able to still access it. So that's good. But before Lee's last day, he's at the office, gathering some of his stuff, and he sees a fax come in. And there were two names at the top, Kelly Martin and Christopher Duntsch. Now, at this point, Kelly's body had not had an autopsy performed, and when Lee saw this fax and, of course, recognized Chris's name and, saw that Kelly was dead, he went to his supervisor, who assured him, don't worry, this is being looked into. And it was here that Lee started to realize that, Chris's screw up on me, that wasn't like a fluke, that wasn't like a once in a lifetime screw up. And by the way, ultimately, 6 weeks after her death, Kelly's death would be ruled an accident. Chris would end up blaming her death on an allergy, specifically an allergy to the fentanyl that was used. And he would later go on to say, quote, not a single doctor, surgeon, staff, or pathologist of the autopsy ever stated that I surgically caused vascular injury. Okay. Yeah, she just happened to die, right? You had nothing to do with it. And I think it is around this time when, Kelly's death is being looked into and ultimately ruled an accident that Lee started digging into Chris. He found out about the surgeries on Kenneth and Barry. And the more Lee found out, the more he wanted to dig into Chris and just see who this guy was. And it is, digging through Chris's background and researching his education and his training that Lee came across a gap in Chris's education. He said, quote, you don't get to walk away from 2 or 3 years of medical training in the middle of an internship or residency, get to take time off and be slotted directly in the position that you left with no questions asked. Maybe that's how they do it in Tennessee, but according to my training, that's not how they do it here. So yeah, it seems that, I'm guessing it was probably when Chris was in that, rehab program for impaired physicians. I'm guessing that is what Lee discovered. And it seems, that I guess Chris was able to just, pop right back in to where he was or something. I don't know. Now, Kelly would end up being Chris's last patient at Baylor Plano. During their investigation, Baylor Plano officials found that Chris failed to meet their standards of care, and they ended up permanently revoking his surgical privileges. Now, the hospital initiated yet another peer review, but Chris ended up resigning his position April 20th, 2012. And he did this rather than face a possible termination. Now, to avoid the costs of fighting and possibly losing a wrongful termination suit from Chris, apparently it's pretty difficult to get rid of surgeons. And I guess hospitals have to be extra careful when, they do terminate a surgeon. And, they were scared of Chris bringing a lawsuit and then possibly losing. So hospital officials reached a settlement with Chris's lawyers in which Chris would be allowed to resign. And in return, Baylor Plano would issue a letter stating that there were no issues or problems with Chris. Yeah. In fact, Baylor Plano's medical staff director, Patricia Sproles, even wrote a recommendation letter for Chris that stated, quote, there have been no summary or administrative restrictions or suspensions of Dr. Duntsch's medical staff membership or clinical privileges during the time he practiced at Baylor Reg Medical Center in Plano. Basically, maybe not a recommendation letter, but basically saying no, everything was fine here. Everything was fine and dandy here. It was not subjected to peer review. He didn't maim and murder patients. No, we're good. I'm sorry, that just seems completely bizarre to me. Now, had Chris been terminated from Baylor Plano, the hospital would have been required to report him to the National Practitioner Data Bank, the NPDB. And this was created by Congress, and it's supposed to be pretty much a database of physicians who have been suspended or who have had their privileges revoked. The NPDB is only accessible by hospitals, and facilities are federally mandated to report their delinquents. And I was a little unclear on when, but I did read an article that said Chris was supposed to have been overseen by an attending physician, but this was not adhered to. And I'm a little unclear on like when that was. That was like before or after Kelly, not sure. And subsequently, 2 years later in 2014, Baylor Plano was hit with a violation and they were fined $100,000 in December. But a year later, the fine and penalty were withdrawn. The Texas Health and Human Services Commission never said why Baylor Plano got off scot-free, citing that medical records were confidential. Now, after Baylor Plano, Chris did not really suffer long before finding another job. Less than 4 months after being pushed out from Baylor Plano, Chris moved on to the Dallas Medical Center, and this was located in Farmers Branch. Now, it is at this point that the affair with Kimberly kind of fizzles. She did not follow Chris to Dallas Medical Center. She ended up filing a temporary protective order against Chris in April of 2012, so right as he was being pushed out of Baylor Plano. And this was after he had showed up at her house, like unexpectedly, like banging at her on her window at like 2 a.m. Kimberly also never reported Chris up the ladder, and she claimed that she never saw him drunk or high or suffering from withdrawal when he was on duty, even though she would later admit that, she saw him drinking, doing research after hours in his office. Kimberly said that Chris was prone to hyperbole and had a questionable sense of humor. Apparently, one of Chris's favorite things to say was, quote, "You can kiss my black ass while I'm watching black girl porn on my monitor." Yeah, this guy is so bizarre. So at Dallas Medical Center, I'm just going to say DMC. So at DMC, Chris was granted temporary privileges until hospital officials could, obtain his records from Baylor Plano and, dot all the I's and cross all the T's and all that, right? So he had like temporary privileges there. Chris ended up lasting less than a week at DMC, but unfortunately, even though he was only at DMC for less than a week, he would get his hands on 2 more patients. So the first patient was 63-year-old Floella Brown, and she was Chris's first operation at DMC, and it was on July 24th, 2012. So like Jerry, Floella's vertebral artery was damaged, and during her surgery, Chris severed it, causing massive bleeding. However, unlike Jerry, Floella suffered from hypertension, which made her susceptible to strokes. And when she's bleeding, Chris once again refuses to abort the procedure. He then packed the wound with too much of a substance that's like intended to stop bleeding, like he put too much of that in there. And Floella suffered a, quote, massive posterior circulation stroke. Now, for a few hours after Floella's surgery and she's like in critical condition, Chris did not respond to multiple messages paging him. He'd actually left the hospital grounds. He had just taken off and no one could get a hold of him. And when he did finally reemerge hours later, he arrived at the hospital late, looking disheveled. His pupils were pinpoints. And he was wearing the same scrubs that he had been wearing for 3 days. And that was 3 days in a row, by the way. Now, colleagues knew that these scrubs were the same ones that he had worn for 3 days in a row because these scrubs had a huge hole in the butt cheek. One of the nurses, Kyle Kissinger, said, quote, "He didn't wear underwear. That's why it really shined down to me." Yeah, that's how they knew he was wearing the same scrubs. Now, Kyle was also in the OR when Chris had performed on Floella, and when he saw Chris finally emerging into the hospital after people have been trying to get a hold of him for hours, Floella was not doing well. So Kyle saw him, and he said, quote, "The moment he walked in that morning, I immediately got to him and I said, 'Look, you need to call upstairs. There's something wrong with your patient from yesterday.' It was at first met with a little concern, almost like he was blowing it off. But rather than tend to Floella, Chris just decided to operate on another patient whose surgery he had arrived 45 minutes late for. And this patient was 74-year-old Mary Efford. So Mary's surgery was scheduled there were conflicting reports either the same day as Floella's or several hours after Floella's. But regardless, we know Mary's surgery was scheduled as Floella was not doing well in post-op, Now, Mary was actually a patient of Chris's from Baylor Plano. She had a laminectomy there in 2008, and this procedure had temporarily relieved the pain that she had experienced from her lower back down into her legs, right? She had some chronic debilitating pain that just radiated all the way down. And this procedure she had done in 2008 fixed the pain. But in 2011, that pain returned. And her pain management specialist was actually the one who had recommended Chris. So Mary actually had 2 procedures with Chris, one at Baylor Plano and one at DMC. So at this second procedure at DMC, Mary was supposed to have 2 vertebrae fused together, and they were going to be linked by a metal plate. Now, when it's time to, schedule Mary for surgery and all that stuff, hospital officials and colleagues of Chris, they were at their wits' end with him because Chris was refusing to cancel Mary's surgery and he wasn't caring for Floella. And they told him, either cancel Mary's surgery and go care for Floella, your patient, or transfer her out of your care. But Chris was refusing to do either of these, and instead went on operating on Mary. And in the middle of Mary's operation, Chris suggested that they just drill a hole into Floella's head to relieve the pressure. Yeah. Just nonchalantly. In the end, Chris was, of course, refused permission to do this. Not only was he not qualified for this procedure and had no surgical privileges regarding brain surgery, but DMC did not even have the proper, equipment or facilities or, setup for this kind of procedure. And Chris ended up arguing with Nurse Kyle and, all of the staff, again, as he's operating on Mary, guys. As they're telling him, no, you can't just drill into Floella's head and, you need to just transfer her out of your care. He's arguing with his staff and his colleagues and his nurses while he's performing surgery on Mary. And as he's performing on Mary, Floella slipped into a coma. And it wasn't until hours after she had slipped into this coma that Chris finally acquiesced and transferred Floella out of his care and transferred her to the UT Southwestern Medical Center. 7 hours after he had performed on her. 7 hours. He let her just flail. But by this time, it was much too late for Floella. She was brain dead. Yeah, he had killed another one. Now, let's get back to Mary's surgery, right? So while he's operating on Mary and arguing with his staff, mere hours after botching Floella's operation, Chris severed one of Mary's nerve roots during her spinal fusion surgery, while also operating on the wrong portion of her back. He also twisted a screw into another nerve, left screw holes on the opposite side of her spine, failed to remove the disc that he was supposed to remove, obliterated a nerve root, and left surgical hardware in Mary's muscle tissue, and it was so loose, it touched, you could touch it through the skin and it would move under the skin. Now, despite multiple warnings from his colleagues that he was not performing Mary's surgery correctly and was putting screws in muscle rather than in bone, Chris just ignored. He ignored all of them. He ignored all of this and just continued on. Chris had attempted to put the screw in the left side of her spine 3 times and was unable to, leaving markings behind of his attempts. Mary ended up losing half a gallon of blood in her procedure. Half a gallon. Kyle, remember Kyle Kissinger, the nurse? He was in the OR during Mary's operation, was one of the ones, remember, arguing with Chris. And he said Chris was very distracted. I mean, remember, he was having full-on arguments about another patient's surgery and what to do while operating on another patient. You know what I mean? And he was arguing with people. Mary was left paralyzed. And she later recalled waking up feeling, quote, excruciating pain. A 10 plus on a scale of 1 to 10. Now, several people who were in the operating room with Chris, they suspected Chris had been intoxicated during Mary's surgery, recalling that his pupils were dilated. And here's my question, why has no one, physically stopped this dude? When they see that there's a lot of blood and they're oh my God, we need to, stop this. Why can no one, physically stop him? Is it just because he's is it a weird respect thing in the hierarchy of the medical world? Is it because he has this vulnerable person opened up on very vulnerable areas and so you can't like, I don't know, disrupt that? I was so confused. Like, if so many people said that Chris seemed intoxicated or incompetent, why did nobody, like, physically grab him away from those patients? Like, I don't get it. And yeah, if you have any insight into, like, the medical community and, you know, medical work environments and how they work, please let me know, because I am super curious. Now, longtime spinal surgeon Dr. Robert Henderson performed the salvage surgery on Mary, all right? And when he saw the damage that Chris had done to her, when he saw it, guys, he was certain there would be legal action taken. So certain of it. It was so bad. And as such, he made sure to have, like, all of, like, the surgery, like, documented and recorded and all that stuff, because he was like, dude, there's no way this isn't going to court. He likened what he found when he opened Mary to, like, the result of like a child playing with toys or something. He said, quote, "Immediately upon opening the patient's prior scar, I could see a screw penetrating the dural sac from the left side at the bottom. It was just wobbly there. It was like somebody just threw some Tinker Toys in there or an erector set in there. I had absolutely zero comprehension of how this surgeon could think he had done this procedure correctly." He described Chris's surgery as a, quote, "an assault," and concluded that Mary would have been left bedridden had he not performed the corrective surgery. In fact, he said Chris hadn't even performed Mary's first surgery correctly. Her paperwork showed that the spinal fusion was to be between the L4 and the L5 vertebrae in her lower back, but Chris had performed the procedure between the L3 and the L4 vertebrae. The pain didn't go away, and that is why Mary had to come back for a second operation. Mary was left with a drop foot, which I guess is where, like, you can't lift your feet. Like think about, like, the problems that would cause you. And though she had rehabilitation to fix her right foot, she still suffers this in her left foot. She has to use a walker to walk short distances from her wheelchair, and she can't stand for more than 10 minutes. Dr. Henderson later recalled wondering if Chris was simply an imposter. He just could not believe that an actual, real surgeon who had gone through training and medical school and all that would botch this surgery so badly and to this degree. He just couldn't believe it. He felt anyone with basic knowledge of human anatomy would have known that they were operating on the wrong area of Mary's back. And so, a lot like with Lee Passmore, Dr. Henderson also started digging into Chris and who he was and what were his credentials. He sent Chris's picture to the University of Tennessee, remember, Memphis State University, because he wanted to verify that Chris did indeed have a degree from there. He received confirmation that, you know, Chris did, but he was still not satisfied. And so Dr. Henderson called up Dr. Frederick Boop, who had become the department chair of neurosurgery after Dr. Robertson had left, all right? So he calls up the current head, all right, Dr. Boop. And Dr. Boop told Dr. Henderson in a conversation that Dr. Henderson recorded that Chris had been sent to the impaired physicians program, and he had been sent there when he had refused to submit a drug test after a woman reported seeing him use cocaine. And as we know, Chris, of course, had been allowed to return and complete his residency. And Dr. Boop told Dr. Henderson that Chris had actually spent his final year operating as an attending physician and was not allowed to operate independently. Yeah, this is in his last year of his residency. He was not allowed to operate independently. Dr. Boop said, quote, "It was something that made us all nervous, but we never had any proof. The university said, we can't let you see his personnel file. All we can say is he's fine." Dr. Henderson then called up Jerry Garrison, remember, the president over at Baylor Plano, and she was very careful in what she told Dr. Henderson, most especially because at this point, when Dr. Henderson has contacted her, Lee had brought up a lawsuit against Baylor Plano. So she told Dr. Henderson, quote, "He no longer has privileges here, and I have to be very careful about what I say to you." Meanwhile, over at DMC, Chris maintained that he had been so distraught over Floella's botched surgery that he had placed a screw in Mary 3 millimeters away from where it actually should have been, but he maintained that was the only mistake he had done, all right? That was the only mistake. He would later say, quote, "There is no way to communicate what happened there without a 20-page document of disclosures and events and responsible parties. That venue is a civil or federal jury trial, and I would accept that if it gave way forward to disclose, remedy, address what happened at DMC with these patients." Now, after Floella and Mary's incidents, administrators at DMC revoked Chris's privileges, but even still, Despite these disastrous surgeries, one of which resulted in death, DMC did not report Chris to the NPDB. Now, at the time, hospitals were not required to report doctors who only had temporary privileges there. What a stupid distinction. But it didn't matter. After being let go at DMC, Chris received privileges at Southampton Community Hospital. This was also located in Dallas. And then in December of that same year, 2012, Chris took an additional position at an outpatient clinic named Legacy Surgery Center, and it's now known as Frisco Ambulatory Surgical Center, and it's located in Frisco. So on top of being at Southampton, having temporary surgical privileges there, he also took a job at like an outpatient clinic. And while at Southampton, Chris would maim more patients. So in September of 2012, Jeff Cheney would become Chris's next victim. So in September, Jeff, he was a mechanic, father of 3, grandfather of 6, and he went to Chris to relieve pain that moved from his shoulder all the way down to his arm. Quote, Dr. Duntsch assured me I'd be 100% pain-free immediately after the surgery. He definitely had confidence. And during Jeff's surgery, he damaged Jeff's spinal cord, cutting part of it, leaving Jeff without feeling on the right side of his body. When he awoke, Jeff, quote, felt like I'd been run over by a steamroller. He said Chris just looked down at him and said, quote, I don't know why you're this way. Everything went perfect in there. Obviously not jagweed, like, are you kidding me? Jeff said that he could no longer work as a mechanic, could no longer even lift up his grandchildren, and now has to spend most of his days at home, like in bed, because he's just in so much pain and left with like paralysis. Chris's next patient was Jacqueline Troy, and he operated on her in December of 2012. I was unclear if this was at Southampton or at that outpatient clinic that he was at. Unclear. But during her surgery, Chris cut one of Jacqueline's vocal cords and an artery and also damaged her trachea. Jacqueline's vocal cords were paralyzed, and her esophagus and trachea had become connected in, quote, an unheard of complication. Her esophagus was pinned under a plate near her spine, and Chris had also poked holes in her trachea, leaving her with just one vocal cord. Jacqueline was left barely able to speak above a whisper. She had to be sedated for weeks and had to be fed through a feeding tube for a long period of time because food was getting into her lungs. She ended up receiving corrective surgery 2 weeks after Chris had butchered her when she went to the ER at Texas Health Presbyterian in Dallas. And this so happened to be where Dr. Kirby practiced. And I believe he may have been the one to perform corrective surgery on Jacqueline. Now, despite these botched procedures, Chris was retained at Southampton Community Hospital when new owners bought it. They bought it for $30 million and renamed it University General Hospital. Now, Southampton had been embroiled in some controversies. It included 2 bankruptcies and a former CEO sentenced to prison for healthcare fraud. And the renaming, along with the new ownership, was supposed to be a new start for the hospital, all right? It was one of only 3 hospitals serving Dallas's southern area that included more than 560,000 people. All right, so they were really determined to make sure this hospital didn't get shut down. So even though Chris is still retained at Southampton under the new ownership and the new name, Chris did eventually get reported to the NPDB, but it wasn't by any of the hospitals that had employed Chris. So there was a report dated January 25th, 2013, after Chris was already retained at Southampton, which was then known as University General. And this report shows that Methodist Hospital in the Dallas suburb of McKinney had reported Chris after denying him surgical privileges 6 months earlier, so right as he was being pushed out of Baylor Plano. Apparently, Methodist Hospital was one of the places that Chris had applied, and yeah, they had not, but they did report him. Methodist said that they rejected Chris based on his, quote, substandard or inadequate care at Baylor Plano. Now, nothing else is known about this report. Methodist Hospital has declined to comment at all, but, the report must not have meant much because, as we know, like, Chris just went on performing surgeries and was now retained at University General, where he continued maiming patients. On April 9th, 2013, truck driver and father of 2003, 48-year-old Philip Mayfield became Chris's next victim. He went in for a 45-minute procedure to alleviate back pain that he had developed by driving and loading and unloading trucks and cargo for like 20 years. So he had like really bad, like chronic back pain due to this. In 2012, after suffering a disc herniation, doctors recommended anterior cervical discectomy surgery, which was a procedure to remove the damaged disc from Philip's spine. And this procedure would require going through Philip's neck to retrieve the disc. And for nearly a year, all right, Philip and his wife Angela dutifully did their research. For a year, guys, doing their research. They consulted with 6 different doctors and scoured medical board reviews. Like, they really wanted to do their homework because this was like a serious procedure, so they wanted to get it done right. And even doing their research, because nothing has been done to Chris and he looks so good on paper, they ended up going with Chris. Philip said Chris was very confident when he met him. Quote, "My biggest questions were, did he know what he was doing? And had he ever harmed anyone?" Now, Chris assured the Mayfields that he did these kinds of procedures all the time. It was no big thing. And he told them that he was so good, Philip would be up and driving and unloading trucks within 4 weeks. And convinced of his confidence and skill, and based on their research, they decided on Chris for Philip's surgery. And during his surgery, Chris damaged Philip's spinal cord, drilling into it and cutting through a critical spinal nerve while trying to treat a herniated disc. This left Philip partially paralyzed from the neck down. Paralyzed from the neck down. How scary would that be? His 45-minute surgery turned into hours, and Angela, remember, Philip's wife, was pacing the lobby in the waiting room. Like, wouldn't that freak you out? Like, the surgery should be 45 minutes, and it's like hour after hour after hour. Philip went under the knife at 6 a.m., and Chris did not come out until 1:30 p.m. Chris told Angela that everything went well and she could go back and see her husband. But when Angela rushed to go see her husband, she knew something was immediately off. Like, the staff and the nurses were like, like scrambling around, and like, you know how you can just like tell, like there's just something not right? That's the scene that she walked into. Philip was taken to a different hospital and received a new doctor, but unfortunately, the damage had been done. Philip's spinal cord was already deformed, and the damage Chris caused was irreversible. And they told Philip he would never walk again. Can you, guys, a year of research and like doing all your due diligence, and now he's being told he'll never walk again. Can you imagine that? Philip was put on steroids to bring the swelling down, specifically the swelling of his spinal cord, and he was transferred to the ICU where he stayed for 5 days. But after undergoing intense physical rehabilitation, Philip was able to walk with a cane, but he did continue to experience paralysis on the right side of his body and in his left arm. He also lived with chronic pain, had random fainting spells, and developed syringomyelia, which is a painful condition that cause cysts to form on the spinal cord. Philip also experienced shooting pains all throughout his whole body, guys. Quote, "Physically, I'm nowhere near what I intended on being. I'm a lot worse. It was supposed to be a minor procedure to relieve some pain in my arms, and he ended up cutting into my spinal cord." And unfortunately, Philip would end up dying of COVID on February 12th, 2021. And this was according to his wife Angela, who said that Philip had been left vulnerable to the virus due to the complications left from Chris's botched surgery. I know, as far as I'm concerned, he killed Philip too. Now, despite this botched procedure, in the next month, May 2013, Chris was a special guest at a Meet Our New Specialist dinner, and this was thrown by the University General Hospital. Yeah, despite his maiming of Philip, the hospital was now throwing a, Meet Our Specialist dinner, and Chris was a special guest. Dr. Kirby had also been invited to this event, and when he found out that it was like Chris that they were honoring, he lost it. Quote, "I called down there and raised holy hell." Now, University General has never answered as to why they hired Chris. They've refused all comment on Chris's story, and despite efforts, it is now closed. The hospital is now closed. Now, a lot of people think that University General hired Chris despite everything, despite his past negligence, because apparently neurosurgeons, they bring in the big dollars for the hospital, all right? They bring in money. So after Philip's botched surgery and after being honored at this dinner, Chris continued seeing more patients. He saw one patient, Marshall Tex Muse. He was an avid runner, and his hobby had left him with degenerative disc disease. And so he went to see Chris about it. And when he did, Chris told him, like, oh my God, like, no, you should have had the surgery like 5 years ago. We need to schedule you ASAP. Now, the night before his surgery, Marshall learned of Kelly Martin's death. And he ended up, calling up Chris to ask him about it. Quote, I called Dr. Duntsch up and I said, I saw this online. Immediately, he started yelling and cussing at me, saying, how dare you? I can't believe that you're accusing me of killing someone. He said the patient died from having an allergic reaction to the anesthesia. And this explanation was enough to satisfy Marshall, who continued with his surgery. And during Marshall's surgery, while attempting to remove degenerated discs, Chris left surgical hardware floating between the spine and muscle tissue in Marshall's back. Marshall woke up, of course, in considerable pain, but Chris convinced him, like, no, this is normal, and like, here's some painkillers. This is totes normal. But he had prescribed Marshall so much Percocet that Marshall's pharmacist refused to fill the prescription a second time, saying, quote, the doctor is going to kill the patient. Unfortunately, Marshall ended up spiraling into opioid addiction and losing his wife and his job, and I'm not sure what he's up to today. I so hope that he was able to find help, because that is awful. Another patient of Chris's, named Pam Trusty, she was actually a patient of Chris who actually came out unscathed. Quote, I could walk, and I was on this top side of the ground. And because she was one of the rare ones that walked away relatively unscathed, Chris duped her into being in like an infomercial or an advertisement for his services. So Chris told her that he had been elected the top neurosurgeon in Dallas, and he wanted her to participate in a video about it. There was going to be like an award and stuff, and yeah, they wanted like testimonials. And so Pam, agreed to do it. And in the video, she sings Dr. Duntsch's praises, quote, it's a miracle. Dr. Duntsch is one great man. But Pam would later find out that there was no such award, and that was in fact a commercial / infomercial that Chris posted on his website advertising his services. Yet another patient that Chris maimed was Jennifer Rich. She was supposed to have a minimally invasive fusion surgery, but during her procedure, she lost half her blood volume when Chris cut an artery. Chris told Jennifer's family, though, and was out in the lobby, that the surgery went fine. Jennifer didn't find out until 3 months after her operation how critical her procedure had actually been. She's now relegated to a cane and has someone assist her with her day-to-day needs, as well as help her take care of her children. She said, quote, physically, I can't do the things with my children that I want to. It's hard when someone tells you can't pick up your 2.5-year-old. They had to learn to crawl in my lap. And finally, we get into Chris's last patient who he would maim, and it was Jeff Glidewell. So Jeff had back pain since 2004 when he had gotten into a motorcycle accident, and he went to Chris to relieve the pain. Now, Chris arrived 3 hours late to Jeff's surgery, looked disheveled, had frayed, dirty, worn jeans on, and seemed wholly unprepared for the operation. Now, Jeff wanted to leave right then and there, like he saw how Chris looked and he wanted to nope the F out, but his wife, Robin, and insisted and assured her husband everything's fine. And during Jeff's routine cervical fusion surgery, Chris mistook part of Jeff's neck muscle for a tumor, severed one of Jeff's vocal cords, cutting a, quote, hole the size of a silver dollar in Jeff's esophagus and slicing an artery. Chris then stuffed a surgical sponge in the soft tissue of Jeff's neck, and this was to staunch the bleeding, but he closed Jeff up with the sponge still in there. Despite others in the operating room telling him that yo dude, the sponge is still in there, but Chris, like always, just ignored them. Jeff woke up in immense pain. He couldn't feel his feet, couldn't move his left arm, and he couldn't talk. How scary would that be? His wife Robin was crying and told him that they had to abort the surgery because they had found a tumor that might be cancer. Now, the sponge that was still inside Jeff then triggered a severe blood-borne infection, and this caused Jeff to become septic, and he had pus and saliva pouring out of his neck. and after several days, Dr. Kirby was brought in to do corrective surgery. He transferred Jeff to a completely different hospital, discovered the sponge, which was belaboring Jeff's breathing, and discovered that the incision Chris had made was far from where it should have been. Quote, Dr. Duntsch left the sponge in because if he pulled the sponge out, Mr. Glidewell would have exsanguinated. He'd bleed to death, but that's not any long-term solution. That sponge has got to be removed. You've got to take care of whatever you've injured. Later, Dr. Kirby described what he found when he opened Jeff back up. He said it was the work of a, quote, crazed maniac, and later told Jeff that it was clear Chris had tried to kill him. Dr. Kirby said that it looked like Chris had tried to decapitate Jeff. And he contended that such a botched surgery, quote, has not happened in the United States of America, before saying, quote, this was attempted murder, and it wasn't the first time. In my opinion, we had a serial killer in our medical community. Jeff was left with one vocal cord, permanent damage to his esophagus, and partial paralysis on his left side. And he was still suffering the effects of Chris's botched surgery several years later, and he has undergone over 50 procedures to try to correct what Chris had damaged. At one point, Jeff was only able to eat small bites of food. But like I said, fortunately, Jeff would end up being Chris's last patient at University General. They pushed him out soon after this. Now, Dr. Kirby, I think he had finally had enough of Chris, and I believe this was after he had corrected as much as he could on Jeff. He wrote a detailed complaint about Chris to the Texas Medical Board. He explained Chris's numerous botched surgeries. He reported he had, quote, direct knowledge of 7 patients, quote, Dr. Duntsch has maimed or killed. He said that there was no autopsy performed on Floella because of her family's wishes. Quote, but it is well documented that the stroke was due to a left vertebral artery injury due to Dr. Duntsch's horrendous surgical technique. Apparently, Dr. Hoyle, remember he was the general surgeon way back when, he had also written a complaint to the Texas Medical Board. And Dr. Kirby wrote, quote, I agree completely with Dr. Hoyle's complaint to the board when he stated that Dr. Duntsch is the most careless, clueless, and dangerous spine surgeon either of us have ever seen. And it is after this that a 10-month-long probe ensued. The board called in a veteran neurosurgeon, Dr. Martin Lazar, to review Chris's case. Dr. Lazar was scathing and critical of Chris in his review. He upbraided him for missing clear signs that Kelly Martin was bleeding out, saying that, quote, you can't know that and be a neurosurgeon. And under heavy lobbying by both Drs. Kirby and Henderson, the Texas Medical Board finally suspended Chris's medical license on June 26th, 2013. Now, before they had finally suspended Chris's license, Dr. Kirby had sent the board another letter, a 5-page letter. Because remember, like I said, this probe was 10 months long. So I think Dr. Kirby was getting impatient. So it sent another letter to the medical board saying, quote, let me be blunt. Christopher Duntsch is an impaired physician, a sociopath, and must be stopped from practicing medicine. And at the same time, again, this is just days before they would finally suspend Chris's license, a reporter picked up on the story. This reporter, Brett Shipp, had gotten word of the story and was investigating it, found out about this probe, and found out about the board kind of dragging their feet. So he had called the Texas Medical Board and like, hey, I want to get your side of the story. And then, 3 days later, they had suspended Chris's license. Now, the lead investigator on the case, like on the probe, later said that she personally wanted Chris's license suspended as they were conducting the probe, but apparently the board's attorneys were not a big fan of this idea. Board chairman Erwin Zeitzler later said that complications from neurosurgery are actually more common than you would think. Quote, so none of us rush to judgment. That's not fair. And in the long run, it can come back to being correct. To suspend a physician's license, there has to be a pattern of patient injury. So ultimately, that's what happened. But it took until June 2013 to get that established. He also added that there were many, many board members that just found it hard to believe that a legitimately trained surgeon could be this inept and this incompetent. Now, by this time, right before they would finally suspend Chris's license, license, Dr. Henderson was getting tired of it, all right? He was getting tired of waiting for the board and all this. And so he had actually brought the case to prosecutors to see if there wasn't a legal course of action to take down Chris. Dr. Henderson was really concerned with Chris's personality and charm, and he was really worried that Chris would be able to manipulate his way into an operating room again. And the Texas Medical Board would finally and fully revoke Chris's medical license on December 6th, 2013. Now, after his license gets suspended and revoked, Chris's downward spiral really ramps up. So he ended up moving in with his parents to Denver, Colorado, and while he's in Denver, Chris got a DUI in January of 2014. The arrest report stated that he had been driving on 2 flat tires on the wrong side of the road, and one of the tires, quote, was completely gone and was on the rim. Officers found an empty bottle of Mike's Hard Lemonade on the floorboard, and there was also a full one in the console. Chris would then declare bankruptcy after listing debts of over $1 million. And I'm not sure when he filed bankruptcy, but I know he did end up selling off his shares of Disc Genius, for a 10th of their value. I'm not sure if that was before or after he declared bankruptcy. In March of 2014, 3 of Chris's former patients brought forth separate federal lawsuits against Baylor Plano, and it was Mary, Kenneth, and Lee. They alleged that Baylor Plano allowed Chris to perform surgeries, despite knowing that he was a dangerous, incompetent physician. They also alleged that Baylor Plano made an average net profit of about $65,000 for every surgery that Chris performed. Now, former Texas Attorney General and all-around crapbag human being, Greg Abbott, filed a motion to intervene in these lawsuits, all right? And of course, he intervened on the behalf of Baylor Plano. He had received very generous campaign donations, bribes from the medical industry. So yeah, of course, he was working for his real bosses. He cited Texas's 2003 statute that placed a medical malpractice cap of $250,000, and they had also removed the term gross negligence from the definition of legal malice. And now, to successfully sue a hospital, one had to prove that the facility acted with malice, that in granting a physician surgical privileges, it intended to harm the patient. Baylor Plano said that it cooperated with the Texas Medical Board when they asked, and they did not file their own complaint against Chris because they're aware somebody had already done it, so they didn't feel like they needed to do it. I wonder if that was referencing the January 2013 report by Methodist Hospital. Baylor Plano said that it was, quote, extremely frustrating and difficult dealing with the aftermath of Chris's actions, saying that he came with, quote, references from multiple sources who worked with him in residency and fellowship training programs. We certainly would not knowingly allow one person to compromise the level of quality care that we have worked so hard and invested so much to achieve for our patients and our community. Yeah, that was pretty much their response. Now, all of the lawsuits, except for Lee's, were eventually settled out of court. However, they were also forced to sign non-disclosure agreements, NDAs, so we will never know these patients' real stories. One lawyer involved said that, they really had a dilemma on their hands. It was either, stay and fight, and remember, that's money, that's time, that's resources, or settle and give the families the financial, cushion and situation that they would need for their future medical costs. And it's honestly disgusting that NDAs are used the way that they are, Lee was the only one who didn't settle. And he wanted to take Baylor Plano to court because he wanted to change the Texas law that required patients to prove that the hospital intended to do harm. He wanted to get that changed. And this was when, that Jagweed Abbott had waded into the fray when Lee wasn't going away. Lee said that he saw that if, he doesn't fight, who will? He said, quote, I don't have Facebook. I don't have MySpace. I've taken one selfie in my life on a dare. I don't want my name out there. I don't want to be in your magazine, sir. He was talking to a reporter who was writing an article. I apologize. I don't want to be on Channel 8. I don't want to be on Inside Edition, but it's the only way to get anybody to listen. It might be Baylor. It might be somebody down in Austin. It might be somebody somewhere, but it's the only way you can get your voice out there. The thing is, if you don't push this, with everybody else settling, they're getting away with it again. And I tried finding out any updates on Lee's suit, but I couldn't really find anything. So if you know, or happen, to find an article or something, drop that in the comments and let me know, because I would love to know, like, the status. Now, let's get back to Doctors Henderson and Kirby. Remember how they were tired of the medical board dragging their feet, so they had taken the case to the DA's office, hoping maybe some legal consequences would arise from that. So they had gone to the Dallas County District Attorney's office and had really, like, pleaded with them to take on Chris's case. They were really scared that Chris could just move elsewhere and continue maiming and killing people, because theoretically he could still move to a different state and obtain a medical license. They were convinced that he was a clear and present danger to the public, and so they pleaded with the Dallas County DA's office to do something. And their pleas went nowhere until 2015, 4 months before the statute of limitations would have run out to charge Chris with anything. Now, apparently, part of the problem that the district attorney's office faced was being able to prove that Chris's actions were willful, as defined by Texas law. In their investigation, they obtained that December 2011 email, that rambling email that Chris had sent Kimberly. They interviewed dozens of Chris's former patients and families of victims. And it is said, when investigators first presented their findings to their superiors, they were kind of skeptical. But as more and more of the investigation was uncovered and more patients were listed on there, the superiors started to find themselves in, quote, overwhelming disbelief that a surgeon could do the things Chris had done. Once it was, laid out there, right there, it was so obvious, and it was very shocking and scary. The DA superiors concluded that Chris's actions were in fact criminal, and nothing short of imprisonment would stop him from operating again. And it really was the combination of all the evidence that really won them over. ADA Michelle Sugart would end up leading the prosecution against Chris, and she later recalled that doctors Henderson, Kirby, and Lazar all called her demanding to testify against Chris. Now, apparently, what made this really unusual is that, doctors don't do this in, the medical community. I guess medical professionals don't really outright, testify against each other or accuse each other of other stuff. And this right here was almost unprecedented. So going back to Chris real quick, so remember I said he moved to Denver, Colorado. You're probably wondering, well, what happened with Wendy? Well, so him and Wendy had sort of I think fizzled at that point. And so he was bouncing back and forth between Denver and Dallas to, see his son. And in September of 2014, after he and Wendy had separated, he was arrested for jumping the fence of Wendy's sister's home and trying to kidnap Aiden. And at that moment, Wendy was actually giving birth to Preston at a hospital. And Wendy would later say that this whole thing was just a misunderstanding, and that she had actually asked Chris to pick up Aiden and bring him to her at the hospital. But I'm not sure why Chris would jump the fence, though. I don't know, maybe he was spiraling. And Chris's spiral would continue. In March of 2015, he was seen beating at the doors of a closed Chase bank in North Dallas. There was blood all over his hands and face. He was wearing the shirt of his black scrubs that were also covered in blood, and he was rambling on about his family being in danger and just seemed really unstable. He was taken to nearby Green Oak Psychiatric Hospital for evaluation, and I don't know what happened with that, if he was released. I tried finding more information about that. The next month in April, Chris was arrested for stealing $887.30 worth of merchandise from Walmart. He had stolen a wallet, cologne, necklaces, a walkie-talkie, 5 pairs of sunglasses, 5 watches, 2 pairs of shoes, 4 ties, and 2 briefcases. Apparently, he had put the merchandise in bags that he had taken from the register, I'm guessing at self-checkout. He had picked out a pair of trousers, put them on in a dressing room, put his own pants back in the cart, and had just walked out of the store, all nonchalantly. And around the same time that he's really spiraling and really exhibiting some questionable, frightening behavior, Kimberly said that she had found Chris had broken into her apartment. She said she came home one day to find him in there. How freaky would that be? He was covered in blood. He told her that he had been attacked by an investigator who was working for the attorneys who represented his patients. And of course, the story of his had never been corroborated, because I guarantee you it wasn't true. The next month, in May, things are just going really downhill for Chris at this point. In May, the Texas Observer published an article, and it was titled, quote, "Sociopath Surgeon Duntsch Arrested for Shoplifting Pants." Yeah, at this point, the local Dallas media, Texas media, I think even national media had picked up on this story, and they were following every twist and turn. In the comment section, section of this article, apparently Chris went off on like this rambling, just incoherent tangent, saying that like everyone was conspiring against him. And apparently when printed out, this rambling, like just nonsensical, just word salad went on for 80 pages. He said Barry's surgery was a, quote, perfect success, and specifically called out Dr. Kirby. Quote, you used the word without explanation, impaired physician and sociopath. Since I'm going to sue you for libel and slander of a criminal nature, this might be a good point to defend this comment. Chris was ultimately arrested in Dallas a couple months later on July 21st, 2015, a year and a half after his license had been fully revoked. That same month, a grand jury indicted Chris on all charges. 6 felony accounts of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, 5 counts of aggravated assault resulting in serious bodily harm, 5 counts of aggravated assault causing serious bodily injury, and 1 count of injury to an elderly person, and this was for Mary's surgery. Now, prosecutors put a high priority on this specific charge because it provided the widest sentencing range, and Chris could face up to life in prison. They also thought that it would be the easiest charge to prove, as Chris had been repeatedly told throughout the operation that he was not placing the hardware in the correct position. And I guess fluoroscopy images from Mary's surgery also proved this point, so they thought this was like the strongest charge that they had that they could prove in court. Prosecutors really wanted to ensure that Chris received a sentence long enough that he would never be able to operate medicine again. And for the reasons already discussed, prosecutors brought up the elderly abuse charge first. Chris, of course, pleaded not guilty, and he would end up waiting 2 years behind bars as his case made its way through the court system. And as he was awaiting trial, Chris would send rambling statements, emails, PDFs to anyone who would listen, claiming that he was innocent and everyone was just conspiring against him. He alleged he was at the center of a vast conspiracy to bilk money from the hospitals where he had worked. He argued that his former patients were all liars, they were all lying, and they were telling tall tales. He insisted that Lee was perfectly fine after his surgery, and he said that he had proof of this because Lee's daughter had sent him a thank you card after her father's surgery. Okay, Chris. Chris's trial finally began on February 2nd, 2017, and it would end up lasting 13 days. By this point, Chris was pretty much penniless, and he had to have a court-appointed public defender. At his trial, D.A. Sugar argued that Chris should have known that he was likely to hurt others unless he had changed his approach, and that his failure to learn from his past mistakes demonstrated that the maiming of Mary was in fact intentional. She also faulted Chris's employers at the hospital for not reporting him to the proper authorities and further up the chain. She argued that Chris was motivated to continue operating due to the lucrative salary he brought in, and though Chris's defense tried to get it blocked, the judge allowed the prosecution to call all of Chris's former patients to the stand. Now, Chris's defense tried to maintain that Chris had not realized just how poorly he performed as a surgeon. Not until he heard all the prosecution's experts tell the jury about his many blunders in the OR, he just hadn't really noticed. His defense blamed Chris's lack of poor skill on poor training and lack of oversight by the hospitals he had been employed at. The director of neurosurgery at UT Southwestern, Dr. Carlos Bagley, testified for the defense and said, quote, for the number of catastrophic injuries that occurred over a short period of time, it would be hard-pressed for those deficiencies to not show during training. This was a complete and utter failure of the entire system of checks and balances for patient safety. The only way this happens is the entire system fails the patients. Another neurosurgeon expert testified for the defense, saying, quote, the conditions which created Dr. Duntsch still exist, thereby making it possible for another to come along. Now, to counter this line of argument from the defense, Sugar brought forth that 2011 rambling email that Chris had sent Kimberly, and they also brought in Kimberly to testify against Chris. And I think this might have been when she divulged that he had like the Stoli in his desk and he would drink, in his office. And after only 4 hours of deliberations, the jury found Chris guilty of the maiming of Mary, the intentional maiming of Mary. On February 20th, 2017, Chris was sentenced to life in prison. He is currently serving his sentence at the OB Ellis unit outside Huntsville, Texas. He will not be eligible for parole until 2045, when he will will be 74 years old. It was found that Chris maimed or killed 33 out of 38 of his patients in 2 years. Mary, who was wheelchair-bound, spoke after the verdict, saying, quote, "I think it's going to be like a floodgate that's going to really open. Crying. I'll do some crying, and I'll reflect back on how difficult those first months were afterwards. I had so much anger because my life changed so much. I was very independent, and I had to become dependent on others for transportation, for my meals, for a lot of things. I think all of us will be thinking about things like this, and hopefully there will be some tighter controls, more accountability in a lot of areas, so something like this won't happen again. It shouldn't happen again." On December 10th, 2018, the Texas Court of Appeals rejected Chris's appeal, and on May 8th, 2019, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals refused Chris's request for a discretionary review. And I know the hospitals that Chris was employed at are facing their own, civil suits, and these are, of course, from Chris's former patients. I think some may still be ongoing to this day, not too sure. And Chris's conviction has been called precedent setting because it is believed to be the first time a physician has been convicted on criminal charges for actions in the course of their medical work. So it was a pretty big deal. Disc Genius is still in operation. Remember, Chris's company. They work out of Salt Lake City, and they have successfully completed several rounds of funding, and according to a recent press release, are conducting trials of their stem cell technology on people in Japan and have plans to test on people in the US as well. Their current funding amount is $68 million. And in 2021, Chris's case was made into a streaming limited series on Peacock called Dr. Death. Joshua Jackson played Chris, Christian Slater played Dr. Kirby, and Alec Baldwin played Dr. Henderson. They also released a companion docu-series to go with the Dr. Death series called Dr. Death, The Undoctored Story. And finally, Wendy, she moved on, had a third child with her live-in boyfriend, while raising Preston and Aiden, her and Chris's two sons. In late 2016, she had to move out of Dallas due to, the negative press coverage of being, Dr. Death's girlfriend. Ex-girlfriend, and she ended up moving to Springtown, 60 miles outside of Dallas. Unclear if she's still living there, but there is a court record filed in July of 2018 in Parker County, and it suggests that Wendy had problems with a man, and this man's name was David Sean Mins. She had asked for a protective order against him, which a judge granted in February of 2019. The case type was listed as protective orders, no divorce. And according to a Facebook post of hers from October of 2021, she listed her relationship status as single and wrote that she was a consultant with NBC in her bio. Quote, "Part of my past is on Dr. Death NBC series." And apparently she has promoted the series a few times on her Facebook. And, yeah, that was a case of Christopher Duntsch, aka Dr. Death. And let me tell you, when I was doing research on this, not only was my back spazzing out, when I was reading about the surgeries, but man, this just totally freaks me out. The doctor is scary enough, but to have to go under the knife and dude, spinal surgery? I feel like that's a big deal, oh my God. And can you imagine? I can't. It really freaks me out and gives me the creeps. And that's why I wanted to, make this one the Halloween case, because it really freaked me out. And yeah, real quick, let me go ahead and change into my Halloween costume. Ta-da! I don't know if any of y'all are fans of Doctor Who, but yeah, I just kind of threw in my little closet cosplay here of Rose Tyler. Got my little sonic screwdriver. Yeah, I don't really know what to do for Halloween, so I just usually do easy stuff. And yeah, just wanted to show y'all my costume. Let me know what you guys are doing for Halloween. Let me know what you're dressing up as, what your kiddos are dressing up as. And yeah, next week will be in November. And not just that, it will be my birthday week. And I have got a case that is very well known, but I personally have never been able to do a deep dive into it. And so I decided, you know what? For a birthday treat, that's what I'm going to gonna do. So I will see you back here next week. Have a safe and happy and wonderfully awesome Halloween. Remember, don't drink and drive, alright? Don't be an idiot. Just, come on. In the days of Uber and Lyft, there's just really not an excuse. So come on. I don't gotta tell you. I'm sure you are way smarter than that. Alrighty, y'all. Until we meet again next week, take care out there. Have a safe and happy Halloween. And remember, don't be a D-bag, alright? Don't be a jagweed. Don't be a douche. Just be a decent person. And don't ruin anyone's Halloween, alright? Alrighty, y'all. I will see you next week. Oh, also, real quick, thank you again, Burgundy Baby, for requesting this case. This was a wild one, so thank you again. Alrighty, now I'll let y'all go. Bye-bye.